Welcome to another week of Past and Presents. This week we're again at Bethel University, but we're going to broaden out a little beyond the history department to visit some other venues on campus and even off campus. What we're going to do this week is talk to a few people who studied history or social studies back in their days at Bethel and then at various points came back to work at their alma mater. We're going to start off here on the football field, the home of Bethel's perennially nationally ranked football team, with Scott Kirchhoff. Scott is a 2003, 2004?
2003.
2003 graduate of History and Social Studies. In his time was an award-winning quarterback for the Bethel Royal football team, and now does a few things at Bethel. Let's start in the past and then turn to the present. Scott, do you have a favorite memory of being in the history department back in the day?
Yeah, my favorite memory was actually my senior seminar class. I took a one-on-one class with Kevin Craig, and my paper was actually based on the history of football. So I traced the lineages of how offenses worked and functioned, and I don't know how much Kevin knew about the history of football, and I think he enjoyed it just as much as I did. So
I think it's always struck me that there's a fair number of history and social studies folks on the football team, and you coach quarterbacks as well as some of the other stuff you do.
Yeah.
But other programs as well, volleyball, baseball, cross country, a few different things. Does that surprise you in a sense? Does it make sense that you get those kind of student athletes doing history but also playing sports?
Yeah, I think there's a natural link when you think about history and leadership, and naturally we use a lot of Band of Brothers language within our football program, and so when you think about how much intensity goes into, when you think of war or something along those lines, the bonds that are formed between people and individuals with their leader and how they follow their leader, but then on top of that, how they serve one another. I think that's the premise of athletics too, in the sense that when you have a great team, and that's our foundation as a football program, is how we serve one another, how we have to fight through very difficult things, and then on top of that, there's joy and there's pain and sorrow when you lose and all that type of stuff. And so I think naturally there's a link between a lot of students, and it's a lineage too, where your social studies teacher in high school was also a coach, but then on top of that you see there's a connection between the historical side of leadership and camaraderie, and then on top of that the athletic side. So I think it's a natural fit for most students.
Okay, thanks. Some of you might have met Scott before. He also has worked in Bethel's admissions office. Throughout the webisode today we're going to meet people doing other kinds of jobs who have history majors, so we'll continue that on Past and Presents. So this week on Past and Presents, we'll be talking about different fields of history, different genres, different topics. And as we continue to talk to some Bethel History alumni who work at Bethel, we're with Ralph Gustafson, who works with church relations at Bethel. And you were a history major. Can I ask the year you graduated?
1974.
And did you have a favorite field of history when you were a student?
I loved American history. I loved it all, but American history really excited me and dug into that most deeply.
So what do you do now at Bethel? What are some of the activities you engage in?
Well, my official title is Executive Minister for Church Relations, and that includes obviously relating to our churches. How do we communicate to them, stay connected to them, and engage them in the mission of Bethel? But also seminary alumni is also an area of my responsibility, and there's obviously a natural connection between those two. So working with the same kind of principles of how do we engage our alumni from the seminary to stay a part of what Bethel's seeking to do.
Sure. So as executive minister, you've probably been a pastor at some point in your life as well?
Yes. On several occasions. I've pastored in about 3 different churches, and probably had about 25 years of pastoral ministry as a part of what I've done since leaving Bethel, and actually part of it while I was at Bethel Seminary.
So as a pastor, as executive minister of church relations, or both, how do you feel like having once been a history student, has it prepared you in some way, whether I don't even know how you would begin to answer that, but do you see connections between your studies and what you do professionally?
Absolutely. I guess my studies in history, I think, really helped me prepare to understand a broader perspective of the world and about God's movement in the world in a whole variety of ways through history. I think it engaged me in a discipline of reading that was very important in pastoral ministry and teaching, preaching, and all the different things that went on there. And I think I even learned some of the leadership qualities that were essential to leading in pastoral ministry, leading a camping and youth ministry program, and all the rest, from even reading some of the autobiographies, the biographies about famous leaders, and so picked up things from that. So I definitely saw a correlation to it.
Well, thanks for your time, Ralph. We're going to throw it over now to our faculty to talk a little bit more about different fields within history, including American history, but maybe some European and other histories too. Okay. So welcome back to our second conversation. We have Dinah Magnuson and Amy Poppinga joining us. In the first one, we talked in very broad strokes about what it is that historians do, the nature of the discipline as compared to other disciplines. Now we're going to look within the discipline and talk about some distinctive fields within history. This will not be an exhaustive discussion of all the fields historians do, but we'll talk about at least maybe two from each of you that you have some connection to. So Dinah, let's start with you. And as a U.S. historian, you do a lot of things within that, including history of the census, women's history we'll talk about, but I think an important field for us to start with is maybe social history, broadly defined. I would guess at some point, even in high school, students have encountered the idea that maybe you don't just study the great dead white men of a field, that's important to history from the bottom up. So what do we mean when we say social history? How is that distinctive from, say, political history?
Well, social history usually is looking at common people, but also as, in terms of methodology, drawing cross disciplines. I think that's one of the strengths of social history, is that social historians use method of, for example, demographers or sociologists or anthropologists, psychology, history to tell a story. Because, for example, if you're a political historian, there are certain types of sources that you would use. But if you're interested, say, in the history of the family, there's no one place that you can go to get the data that you need. So you draw across disciplines. And it's a pretty new field in terms of the discipline, and that's because of the growth of computers and access to laptops and desktops and data sets and all those sorts of things. And so social historians really draw on those things as well.
Sure. Well, we'll talk more about evidence actually in the next two episodes coming up. But you mentioned this. I think what would social historians draw from, say, what kind of evidence are anthropologists or sociologists or demographers providing that help social historians?
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of populations. If you're trying to, track migration, you can use census data, but it's not going to be super helpful because census data is taken, state data is taken every 5 years, federal data is taken every 10 years. But you have like city directories that you could look at to try and track migration. Sociologists have a way of thinking about organization and hierarchy that could be useful to talk about people's experience.
I would think it also gives you kind of a theory too.
Exactly, yeah. And maybe anthropology, the drawing on trying to just look at maybe a subpopulation or a subgroup and to do an ethnography. So those kinds of, methodology, drawing on that can really help tell a story. And I guess what I didn't finish my thought about social history coming out of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, and people wanting to tell their own story, not just the story of great white dead men, as you said, but of immigrant populations, of women, different subgroups, and that comes out of that experience of the civil rights movement.
Right. So the social turn has been just transformative, not just in American history, but I see it in European history and in every other field. In the last 10, 15 years especially, it feels like religious history is suddenly, I don't know if it's sudden, but in terms of growth of number of dissertations, religious history is number one right now. As someone who studies religion, what do you think accounts for that?
I think there's a couple of reasons, depending upon what religious history we want to talk about specifically, but religious history, as you said, broadly, has been growing as a field, and I think that part of that has been that as we become, in the United States, a more religiously diverse society, and part of it has to do, I think, with September 11th putting religion onto the radar and into conversations where for the prior 20 or 30 years, I think the approach to religious diversity was that the best way to deal with religious diversity is to simply ignore religion when we can. So we ignore it in the schools.
Don't ask, don't tell.
Yes, don't ask, don't tell. So it can be something in your private life, but we don't want to make it part of your public life. And so I think, therefore, there was sort of, scrutiny of allowing religion to play too much of a role. Religious studies scholars even questioning that, being the first to actually question if religious studies should even be a discipline, if that, and that has sort of all shifted. And I think that that part of that has been that religion has pushed back against that instead, especially I think in the United States, where there is, it isn't perfect, but thinking globally, there is a tremendous amount of respect for tolerance of religion. And it can't be ignored. So there is the need to say you can't do any of social study or social science disciplines and ignore history and ignore religion and take religion out of it. So instead now, when you're looking at anthropology or sociology, you have to take into account, you have to treat, you can't sort of push religion to the side, but instead you have to allow it to have the weight and the you have to treat it as real, whether you as the person studying it think it's real or not.
Well,
and there's more respect for that.
That gets me to a question, which is that the terminology is tricky because in the sense you are both religious historians and that you are of a certain certain faith, and so especially maybe as you encounter Christianity in what you do in religious studies, from what you do with U.S. history, how do you grapple with that? Because I would assume one of the reasons there's pushback against religious studies as a field is that it's not the promotion of religion necessarily, and you don't want to show favoritism towards religion, but you also want to take seriously this is an important category within social history.
A variable like anything else, like geography or age or marital status. Your faith.
Right, it helps explain the nature of it.
Yeah, and you have to, I think that one of the things that I actually feel has privileged me a little bit as a religious historian and is that when I have done certain types of work, even though the community that I study is not my own religious tradition, there's sort of a respect for, thank you for respecting my religion and recognizing that when I say this is what shapes me or what motivates me, or when you're looking at, say, Islamic legal scholars and the fact that you have these amazing people who are studying, law within their particular religious context, that when you either demonstrate or actually articulate that you respect and will value that this is what a particular group of people believe, I think that actually that enriches your work and kind of opens doors for you that I think would be closed if you were always coming at it from a skeptical place of, you do all of this, but I don't think it's really true.
Many people who study history oftentimes don't know much about Latin America. It's like 1/5 of the world's landmass. The largest Hispanic population in the world is there. The largest Catholic population is there. A lot of theology is coming from there. One of the most vibrant parts of the church today is the Hispanic church. We know that a few years ago, Hispanics surpassed every other ethnic group or minority ethnic group as the largest group in America. By mid-century, it will continue doing that. It's kind of where things are headed, economically, culturally, religiously, and so I think it'd be great for students to take a class like that so they kind of have a feel for that. Z-Tag is an intercultural course, so there's a minimum, I believe, of like 25 hours of personal intercultural contact with a culture different from your own. The students will be farmed out to different Hispanic churches in the Twin Cities. And the goal is that will actually be their church for the semester. So they should have an understanding of the history of that particular church, how they came to be, what they care about, what's theologically and communally important to them. And they'll do that by going there and simply being a part of the congregation. If they go through the process, almost all the time, they will come away truly understanding a world different from theirs.
We'll pick up our conversation about fields of history in just a few minutes, but we're back with another Bethel History alum who's working at Bethel. Mike Gehrz, when did you graduate from Bethel?
So I graduated in 2004, and then actually was asked back. A job opened up here in the IT department, was asked back right after that, so I went right out from my undergrad, right back into Bethel as for work.
And what is your job title and what kind of things do you do?
So right now I direct our web and creative services, which means we take care of everything from the website and print and marketing materials. We produce that on our team to the web technology, so the technology that runs that stuff behind the scenes.
So they've probably seen some of your work at some point.
Yeah, exactly.
Process,
yep,
right?
yep. So if you've been to the website, you logged into Blink or used Moodle, that's stuff our team is behind.
So if you can give a short version of the story, how does someone get from preparing to be a history teacher to doing what you just described?
Yeah, well, so I started out computer science, right? And I wanted to solve problems. I was really interested in doing that, but it was pretty behind the scenes. And so as I got more into it, I was like, I really would like to deal with people. And so I switched to education. We didn't have an education and technology track, but I always have had a passion for history and social studies. Got into that and just loved my coursework, and got into my student teaching. I always planned on going out and teaching, and ultimately ended up staying here at Bethel. But my history and social studies work when I was a student here prepared me to do what I'm doing now, like really set me up for success. And I tell people I'll hire an education major or history major anytime, because if you can write, read, stand up in front of people, present, plan your day down to the minute, you can pretty much accomplish any job.
Okay, you just guaranteed a bunch of interview requests from the people watching this.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Mike, for sharing that.
Yeah.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, China, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I have always liked stories, and so when I was in college, I quickly dispatched with my music and Spanish double major in favor of history and English double major. And so that was a pretty pivotal thing, just taking classes and reading stories and falling in love with a lot of different kinds of stories. And then I never really considered being a historian, because I didn't know really those people existed until I got to college. But I had a friend in college, Tim, who was aware that I was thinking about applying to law school. My father was a police officer, and my dream was to help him put people in jail by being a prosecuting attorney. But we sort of talked about that, and we thought maybe that would maybe not be the best development of my character. So he said maybe I should think about taking the GRE, and it sort of went from there. So I took the GRE and did all right, and applied and got in, and there it is. I study prostitution, and that's sort of an odd thing to study probably at Bethel University. So the thing that was very frustrating to me about studying prostitution even as a graduate student was that I kept encountering men. I really wanted to study women, but I kept encountering men. And so what happened as a result of just being in the sources and letting the sources talk to me was I ended up writing something that was much more corporate history. So how does the business of prostitution change over time, so that it starts out in the 19th century being one in which women can actually be at the sort of top of the hierarchy and make a lot of money, to one in which men are very much at the top of the business hierarchy and actually organize it along corporate kinds of structures. And so it's actually much more of an economic history than it is a social history. And then I'm also really fascinated by the geography. And so my first article actually got published in the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies, because it was looking at how prostitution and sexuality informs or is informed by our geography. So I do weird stuff. And I love maps. So Poppinga and I have that in common.
I think it offers a unique perspective on American history. Many students are at least somewhat familiar with the storyline, the narrative of American history, but they haven't gone on that journey from the perspective of a particular group of people. Students can really engage in these women's lives and see a lot of, I think, of themselves. That here's a woman who lived a long time ago, but yet she's experiencing some of the same emotions or fears or challenges that I face in the 21st century. Jade Snow is a woman that I really, really resonate with. I have nothing in common with her, but I just love her story and how she tells her story. Her story is Fifth Chinese Daughter, and it's an autobiography of growing up in California in the 1930s and 40s. And she is one of 9 children, but she's the 5th daughter. And that's how she's referred to. She's the 5th daughter in the family, and her quest for education. And so it really is something as students we can explore, what kind of drive do you have for your education? In many of these women, they're struggling with personhood and identity and education and what it means to be a woman, what it means to be an American. So lots of things that you can grab onto. It's also really empowering to be a part of these women's lives for a semester. So I would encourage students to take the course.
We're back at a different part of Bethel. This is the Bethel Office Center, the home to the College of Adult and Professional Studies and the Graduate School, at least the current home. It might have moved by the time you see this. We're here with Emily Busta, who at least a few years ago was Emily Katzenmeyer, one of the star students of history and political science down in AC Second. Emily, do you have any particularly fond memories of your time as a history student?
I do. I have a great story involving G.W. Carlson. He's the former chair of the history department and now retired professor. One day I was getting ready to take my Modern Russia final and got to class and I was all prepared. And a few weeks prior to this, GW was on one of his kicks to wear the tackiest ties that he could around Bethel for the honor of having the tackiest ties. And so before the final started, another student brought in this giant bag full of tacky ties for GW. So GW decided to go through the entire bag and look for the ugliest, worst tie that he could find. He put it on, passed out the test, was sitting at the front of the desk, grading his own papers, when all of a sudden the tie started singing, "We wish you a Merry Christmas." So all 30 students or whatever that were in the class were frantically trying to write out their essays and everything, and were interrupted by GW's tie. Well, GW had no idea how to turn off the tie. Sure. And instead of taking it off, he just let it ring and ring and ring. Well, about a half hour later, he bumped it again and interrupted us again. This went on through the entire 2-hour final.
I hadn't heard that, but that fits.
Yes.
Exactly. You've just got a glimmer of one of our longest serving professors, actually. Now, Emily, you work at CAPS GS, and my guess is most of our day college students, the CAPS students, probably have no idea CAPS GS exists. Can you just tell us a little bit about what it is?
Sure. So, like Chris said, the CAPS GS stands for the College of Adult and Professional Studies and Graduate School. It mainly serves adult students that don't have a bachelor's degree that want to complete their bachelor's, or if they do have a bachelor's that they want to go on and get a master's degree. So the format for grad school looks a little bit different. You're in a cohort, which means that you're taking all the classes with the same students the entire time that you're in the program. And you're taking one class at a time, 5 or 6 weeks at a time, year-round.
So these are usually working adults who have gone back to get a master's. So it's early in these students' careers, but they might be thinking about graduate school. What kind of programs might they want to look at Bethel?
Sure. If you want to go more of the business route, we have a strategic leadership and an MBA program. If you're looking more for the education, we do have a Master's of Art in Teaching. So if you want to get your history degree now and then come back and get the teaching aspect, we can do that. You get the master's with it. Special ed too. I mean, we have a lot of people that want to transition into special ed that hold a lot of different degrees.
Sure. Yeah, we'll especially probably talk about the MAT program. I mean, I think it's actually becoming more common to do the history major and then go on, maybe even right away to get the MAT.
And social studies is a very common license that we provide.
Okay. Thanks, Emily, for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We're going to throw it back to our faculty to keep talking about different fields in history. So, Diana, one of the other hats you wear at Bethel is you help coordinate the gender studies minor, and you also teach a class on history of women in America. So first of all, just another terminological question. I mean, is women's history of gender? Are they used interchangeably? Is one more preferred now? Is there a distinction between, I would assume history of gender is a broader category than women's history.
Right. I guess I don't use them interchangeably. I think of them differently. Obviously, when you do women's history, you also talk about gender, and when you do gender history or gender studies, you include women in the conversation, but I just think it is the focus. I think of gender studies as much more broad. than the history of women.
So for either or for both, how have those fields changed over time? How has the historical study of women or of gender developed in the past 20,
Well, I
30
would say
years?
in the same ways that social science has changed, or any field has changed with our access to data and data sets. The way we can manipulate the data because of technology has impacted it. Just our global perspective has changed the field. The fact that there's money for these studies, that we have people who are credentialed doing them, that you have departments, gender studies departments and women's studies departments. I mean, that changes the field, gives it credibility. It's not just this sort of side thing that's going on. So.
Gender studies is innately interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. So this maybe kind of harkens back to our first conversation. How does a historian's approach to gender studies differ from a philosopher's approach, a social scientist's approach? You're probably asking some of the same questions, but do you answer them differently?
Well, I guess my context would be like how a lot of gender studies programs are housed in English departments. So, the kind of data that you use, the questions that you ask might be different. I don't know. I haven't team taught a course with a philosopher here in gender studies, so I'm not sure how Sarah Shady, for example, would approach the topic. But I just think maybe in terms of the sources that you would use, that you'd be drawn to, I'd be more likely drawn to, well, obviously, American sources to tell the story, and she might be drawn to philosophers of other parts of the world. So
it's interesting that you do say that even within American history, there's been sometimes called the transnational turn. We can't do simply national history in isolation.
Right.
So I think both of you probably encountered this. Where have you seen this turn in the specific research or teaching fields you have, or do you have an example of how that shows up?
Yeah, well, I guess a specific example that comes to mind is when I teach early American history, and it used to be very colonial. It was just what became the United States, so the 13 colonies, and now it's referred to as Atlantic studies. So looking at the Atlantic world and the interaction between, that rim of in the Atlantic world. So it's really transformed textbooks and the kind of sources that get used, the questions that get asked, things that just get investigated are so different.
Yeah, I've seen that even in I read an essay by Lynn Hunt, who's a historian of the French Revolution, former president of the American Historical Association, and she said you can't really write the history of the French Revolution without making reference to, say, the Caribbean, the slave trade, the slave revolts in Santo Domingo. And she even suggests globalization needs to become this category that we think of across time.
Well, and that's in my class we've connected the Haitian Revolution with the Louisiana Purchase, and it's really interesting to think about Thomas Jefferson and what he thought about slavery and democracy and the Republic and all of that in light of it's made possible because of the Haitian Revolution.
Right.
So, and that's just, it's mind-blowing when you start to make those kinds of connections.
Amy, another field that you teach, in addition to Islamic studies, religious history, is environmental history, another, I'd say, fairly hot and recently developed field. Can you tell us what is distinctive about environmental history, the questions it asks, the sources it uses?
So the goal of environmental history, kind of a bumper sticker tagline, is to put nature back into historical studies and to say what role has nature played in human beings' actions? How have human beings tried to shape nature? When have they been conquered by nature? What are the things we still can't do, but yet we still seek to do? So one of the things we talk about is sort of weather. Weather is the one thing that while we can work with it, we still can't control it. We've tried.
We know it's coming.
We've tried, unsuccessfully. We've tried, but one thing. So the discipline is to try to get students to understand really how we live. I mean, to bring in the field of human ecology and to say how is the way that you live determined by where you live? So why have certain societies advanced or developed faster than others? What part have resources played in that advancement? And then to understand and to be able to kind of make predictions and track patterns based on, and so you look at things like vegetation, you look at climate, and you try to determine, okay, well, what advantages do certain parts of the world have based on factors that while we've learned to control them and we've learned to figure out what grows best where, how were certain populations really privileged from the very beginning by where they happened to be located. And so much back to what you were saying about that whole notion of Atlantic studies replacing what was colonial studies, environmental history kind of operates in the same way, that no matter where you happen to be focused on, what if you're looking at something that's occurring in North America, if you're looking at the Caribbean, if you're looking at the Middle East, you always have to be thinking in a globalized way to take into consideration how other parts of the world are impacting that particular region. One of the things I really enjoy teaching about it is that I feel like it gives students another lens through which to look at any of the other types of history that they're doing, and then they can kind of now ask there's a new set of questions that they can bring to anything that they happen to be studying and make really good connections. One of the things that environmental history does is really, even though there are certain figures and particular people that we have to know and that we need to study, people are always secondary. You use the analogy of, which is by Ted Steinberg, who's an environmental historian in the United States, of nature's no longer a backdrop. So think of watching a play that you've seen, only now you're trying to completely focus on the scenery instead of the people, and what is the scenery saying about the story. And so again, you kind of develop a skill set that then you can take and apply to any other discipline.
Well, so one example is, I know you two have done things where Diana teaches class in the American Civil War, and I think Amy, you've come into the class or shared.
Yeah, so one of the things that I love about that is that students are learning about specifically the role that the environment played in the Civil War, both how it was manipulated by humans, but how the environment itself played a role in the way that the war plays out. But my job is to lay a foundation before Diana comes in to help the students understand the economy of the South and the resources of the South, and again, vegetation and climate, and the culture, and how culture then is shaped by those factors and how that was different from the North, so that then when Diana comes in and presents her expertise, the students sort of are already aware of, wow, and then what we do is we move that forward, where after Diana has talked about it, the students then move that forward to, we can look at things like again, using a multidisciplinary approach of looking at things like demography, death rates, looking at rates of things like obesity, looking at the economy of the South, and we can trace that back and say, wow, many of these things that really are still or really still leftovers from the Civil War, we can still see the ramifications of those, and they all tie to the environment. So,
okay. Well, Diana, Amy, thanks for talking. Well, as we come to the end of another episode of Past and Presents, hopefully you feel like you have a better sense of the variety of fields in the discipline of history, the kind of questions historians ask. We'll talk more about that next Monday night. But also, maybe you're starting to get a sense of the variety of careers that history majors from Bethel have pursued. We'll continue to look at that as we interview alumni around the Twin Cities and even farther away. And in the last episode of Past and Presents, we'll actually focus just on career vocation in the study of history. We'll close our tour of Bethel this week with a little bit of Bethel history. I'm not going to say any more about it, but the first person to email me with the location of where I'm standing right now might get 1 bonus point towards their grade for this week. Okay, we'll be back next week for another episode of Past and Presents.
Back, baby, back in time.